Hey, listen. Before you scroll away, I need you to see this. A maid was humiliated in front of 100 wealthy guests at the most exclusive party in the city. She stood there, silent, taking every cruel word. But she didn't know who was watching from across the room. And when he finally moved, nobody in that mansion expected what happened next. Stay with me, because this story isn't about a party. It's about a secret that had been buried for 26 years. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you belong to? Drop it in the comments. I love reading where you're all tuning in from. Today's story is one of the most emotional, heartwarming journeys I've ever shared with you. A story about dignity, about the invisible people we walk past every day, and about a truth so shocking it changes everything. Trust me, you will not see this twist coming. Let's begin. Nobody in that ballroom knew her name. The Hayes estate sat on top of a hill in Connecticut, overlooking the Long Island Sound, its windows glowing gold against the November night. Inside, 300 of the wealthiest people on the East Coast sipped champagne beneath crystal chandeliers, celebrating the engagement of Daniel Hayes, the 34-year-old CEO of Hayes Global Investments, to Victoria Lang, daughter of a real estate empire. Grace Miller moved through the crowd in her plain maroon uniform, a silver tray balanced on her palm, her eyes fixed carefully on the floor. She had worked for the Hayes family catering company for 11 years. She knew how to be invisible. She knew how to disappear into wallpaper, into marble columns, into the hum of orchestra music. Invisibility was survival in a house like this. But tonight, invisibility wasn't enough. Started small. A woman in a shimmering gold dress reached for a glass of champagne and, in her haste, knocked the entire tray from Grace's hands. Crystal shattered against the marble floor. Champagne spread in a golden pool, soaking into the hem of Victoria Lang's white engagement gown. The room went quiet. Victoria's face twisted, first in shock, then in fury. "Are you serious right now?" she snapped, stepping back as if the champagne might burn through her skin. "Do you have any idea how much this dress cost?" "I'm so sorry, ma'am," Grace said quietly, already kneeling to gather the broken glass with her bare hands. "It was an accident. Let me." "An accident." Victoria's laugh was sharp and humiliating, meant to be heard by everyone nearby. "People like you don't get to have accidents in a place like this. You're supposed to be careful. That's the one job you have." A few guests chuckled uncomfortably. Others simply watched, the way people watch a car accident they know they shouldn't enjoy but can't look away from. "Please," Grace whispered. "I'll pay for the cleaning." "You couldn't afford to pay for the thread in this dress," Victoria said. She glanced around, playing to her audience now, her voice rising theatrically. "Honestly, whoever hired the help tonight should be fired. Look at her. She can't even hold a tray straight." Grace said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that silence was armor. She kept her head down, kept gathering glass, kept breathing slowly so the tears building behind her eyes wouldn't fall in front of 300 strangers. Then Victoria did something no one expected. She reached down, grabbed the riding crop resting decoratively against a nearby coat rack, a prop from the estate's stable-themed decor, and struck it once against Grace's back. Not hard enough to seriously injure her, but hard enough to leave a mark, hard enough to make the entire room gasp. "Maybe that'll teach you to pay attention," Victoria said, breathless with her own anger. Grace flinched, pressing her palm against her back, her eyes wide with shock rather than pain. For a moment, the ballroom was frozen. 300 people who said nothing did nothing because saying something meant risking their place in that world. And that's when a voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Victoria!" Every head turned. Daniel Hayes stood at the top of the grand staircase, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his face pale with something between disbelief and rage. He hadn't seen the tray fall. He hadn't heard the first cruel words. But he had seen the crop rise and fall against a woman's back in his own home, in front of his own guests, and something inside him went cold. He walked down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, the way a man walks when he is trying very hard not to break something. "Daniel, Victoria started, suddenly aware of how the scene looked from the outside. She ruined my dress, she was clumsy, I just... Give me the crop, Daniel said. Victoria hesitated, then handed it over, her confidence cracking for the first time all evening. Daniel didn't even look at it. He walked past his fiancée entirely and knelt down on the marble floor, directly in front of Grace Miller, in front of everyone. Are you hurt? He asked her, his voice low, gentle, completely different from the voice he'd used moments before. Grace looked up at him, stunned. In 11 years of working events at this house, no member of the Hayes family had ever knelt in front of her. I'm fine, sir, she whispered. Really, You're not fine, Daniel said. You're bleeding. A thin line of red had appeared through the fabric on her shoulder where the crop's metal tip had caught skin. Daniel reached for a linen napkin from a nearby table and pressed it gently against the wound himself, ignoring the horrified murmurs rippling through the crowd. A billionaire on his knees, tending to a maid's wound with his own hands. Someone get the first aid kit from the kitchen, he called out, not looking away from Grace. Now! Nobody moved for a second, too stunned. Then his head housekeeper rushed off. Daniel helped Grace to her feet. Standing this close to her for the first time, something strange happened, something he couldn't quite explain. He looked at her face, really looked at her eyes, at the small scar above her eyebrow, at the way she held herself even in humiliation, spine straight, chin steady. A flicker of memory stirred somewhere deep in him, somewhere he hadn't visited in almost 30 years. He didn't know why. He couldn't place it. But something about her face felt like a door he had forgotten existed. What's your name? He asked quietly. Grace, she answered. Grace Miller. The name meant nothing to him yet. But it would. Soon it would mean everything. Behind them, Victoria's voice rose in outrage. Daniel, are you seriously more concerned about the help than about me right now? Daniel turned to face his fiancée, and for the first time in their 2-year relationship, something in his expression had permanently shifted. Everyone in this room is going to remember what happened tonight, he said, loud enough for all 300 guests to hear. The question is what they're going to remember about you. And about me. He turned back to Grace. Sit down. Someone will bring you water. You are not going back to work tonight. Grace opened her mouth to protest. She needed this job, needed every shift, every dollar. But something in his eyes told her not to argue. Not yet. She had no idea that this single humiliating night was about to unravel a secret that had been buried since the year she gave up the only child she ever had. The party ended 2 hours early. Guests left in a hush of whispered gossip, phones already lighting up with texts about what had happened. Victoria Lang stormed out without saying goodbye to anyone, her engagement ring still catching the chandelier light as she yanked her hand away from the driver who tried to help her into the car. Daniel didn't watch her go. He was in the kitchen, sitting across from Grace Miller at the small staff table usually reserved for the catering crew's coffee breaks, while the house nurse cleaned and bandaged the shallow cut on her shoulder. You really don't need to do this, Mr. Hayes, Grace said for the 3rd time, her voice tight with discomfort. Not from the wound, from the attention. Being seen, truly seen, by someone like him felt more dangerous than any bruise. Daniel, he corrected gently. And yes, I do. He studied her while the nurse worked. There was something achingly familiar about her. Not a memory he could name, but a feeling, like a song heard once as a child and never forgotten, even after the words disappeared. He found himself asking questions he had no business asking a caterer's employee. How long have you worked events like this? 11 years, Grace said. Started when my daughter was small. Needed the income. Something in Daniel's chest tightened at the word daughter, though he couldn't say why. You have a daughter. Grace's eyes flickered, just for a moment, with something that looked like grief wearing the mask of composure. I had a son too, she said quietly. A long time ago. Before my daughter was born. Had. He's not part of my life anymore. She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed 1,000 times to keep from crying. It's a long story, Mr. Hayes. Not one for tonight. Daniel wanted to press further. Some instinct in him screamed that this mattered, that there was a thread here worth pulling, but he saw the raw pain behind her eyes and stopped himself. Some doors, even when they ached to be opened, deserved to be knocked on gently. "I'm sorry," he said instead. "For what happened tonight. For all of it. Victoria had no right." "She's your fiancée," Grace said carefully. "It's not my place to." "She was my fiancée," Daniel corrected. "As of tonight, that's over." Grace's eyes widened. "Mr. Hayes, please don't end an engagement because of me. I'll be fine. I've had worse nights than this." That sentence landed heavier than she intended. Daniel looked at her, at the quiet exhaustion behind her calm exterior, and understood that this woman had survived far more than a humiliating party. There was a whole history behind her eyes, an entire life of swallowed pain, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he felt an overwhelming need to know all of it. "It's not just because of you," he said finally. "Tonight showed me something about who Victoria really is. I should have seen it sooner." The nurse finished bandaging Grace's shoulder and quietly excused herself, leaving the two of them alone in the enormous kitchen, surrounded by half-eaten hors d'oeuvres and cooling coffee. "Can I ask you something personal?" Daniel said. Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Your son," he said carefully. "What happened to him?" Grace's hands wrapped tightly around the mug in front of her, knuckles pale. "I was 19, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alone. No family who would help me. The father left before he even knew I was pregnant. I worked 2 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, and I still couldn't give that baby what he needed. Not even food some weeks." Daniel sat perfectly still, listening. "When he was 8 months old, I made the hardest decision of my life," Grace continued, tears finally slipping free, unstoppable now that the dam had cracked. "I gave him up for adoption. A closed adoption. I never got to know where he went, who he became, if he was happy. The agency told me it was better that way. Clean. No confusion for the child." "Do you know anything about the family who took him?" Daniel asked, his own voice strange and tight, though he couldn't understand why his heart was suddenly pounding. "Only what the caseworker told me before everything went sealed," Grace said. "A wealthy couple. Older. Couldn't have children of their own. She said they lived somewhere in Connecticut. Said they'd give him a good name, a good life. Something he never would have had with me." The kitchen went silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Daniel Hayes had been adopted at 8 months old. He had grown up knowing this fact the way people know the weather on the day they were born. A detail, present but weightless, never questioned deeply. His parents, Richard and Eleanor Hayes, had told him early and often that he was chosen, wanted, loved beyond measure. He had never felt a need to search for anything more. Until tonight. "What year was your son born?" he asked, and his voice shook slightly. Grace looked up, confused by the sudden intensity in his question. 34 years ago. "Why do you?" She stopped. She looked at him, really looked the way he had looked at her earlier, at the shape of his jaw, the particular gray-green of his eyes, the small scar above his eyebrow that mirrored one she'd carried above her own for decades, a birthmark she remembered kissing goodbye on a tiny forehead a lifetime ago. The mug slipped from her hands and shattered against the kitchen floor. Neither of them moved to clean it up. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The shattered mug lay in pieces between them, coffee spreading across the tile in dark rivers, and neither Daniel nor Grace looked down at it. They were looking at each other, searching each other's faces for something too enormous to say out loud. "That's not possible," Daniel finally whispered. "There are thousands of people born that year. Millions." "Your birthday," Grace said, her voice trembling. "What is it?" "March 14th. Grace made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something between a gasp and a sob. "My son was born March 14th, she said. "At Bridgeport Memorial Hospital. I remember because it was raining so hard the power flickered twice during labor." Daniel's hands had gone cold. "I was born at Bridgeport Memorial," he said slowly. "My parents told me that much. They never hid that I was adopted. They just Never had details about the birth mother. Everything was sealed. Closed adoptions were sealed for a reason, Grace said, wiping tears with the back of her wrist. The agency told me it protected everyone. Protected the child from confusion, protected the adoptive family from interference, protected me from— She laughed bitterly. From ever being able to change my mind, I think, more than anything. Daniel stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He paced to the window, staring out at the dark water beyond the estate's lawn. His mind spinning through 34 years of memories, searching for anything that might confirm or deny what his heart was already beginning to believe. I need to know for certain, he said, turning back to her. Not because I doubt you. Because if this is true, if you're really— His voice cracked on the word. I need to know it's real before I let myself believe it. A DNA test, Grace said quietly. I understand. I'd want the same thing if I were in your position. Not because I don't believe you, Daniel repeated, desperate for her to understand. Because I've spent my whole life feeling like there was a piece of me missing, and I never let myself ask why. If this is true, I don't want even a single % of doubt standing between us. Grace nodded, tears still falling freely now, unguarded for the first time all night. There's something else you should know, she said. Something you deserve to hear before any test confirms anything. Tell me. I didn't give you up because I didn't want you, Grace said, her voice breaking apart with the weight of 26 years of unspoken grief. I gave you up because I loved you more than I loved my own comfort, more than my own pride. I was 19, homeless twice that year, working nights cleaning office buildings while pregnant, and I looked at your tiny face and I thought, he deserves warmth. He deserves food every single day. He deserves parents who won't have to choose between rent and formula. I couldn't give you that, so I gave you the only thing I could. I gave you a chance. Daniel's composed, controlled exterior, the same steel exterior that had built a billion-dollar company, that had negotiated deals worth more than small countries, that had never once cracked in a boardroom, finally shattered. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and knelt in front of Grace Miller exactly as he had knelt in front of her hours earlier in the ballroom, except this time there was no wound to bandage, no crisis to manage. This time, there was only a mother and a son, staring at each other across 26 years of silence. I've been paying a company for the last 6 years to run genetic ancestry matches, hoping something would surface, Daniel confessed, his voice raw. I told myself it was curiosity. It was never curiosity. I was looking for you. I just didn't know it. Grace let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I applied for a housekeeping position at this house 4 years ago, she admitted. I didn't know it was your family's estate until I was already 3 months into the job. By then I told myself it didn't matter. This was just a house, just a job. I never imagined I'd actually see you. And when I finally did, at your father's memorial service 2 years ago, I stood in the back of the church and I told myself it was foolish to even wonder. You were at my father's funeral? Daniel asked, stunned. I stood in the very last pew, Grace said. I watched you give the eulogy. You talked about how your father taught you that real strength was gentleness under pressure. I remember thinking, that's exactly the kind of man I hoped you'd become, if I ever let myself hope at all. Daniel closed his eyes, overwhelmed. Somewhere above them in the empty ballroom, the last remnants of the party still lingered. Spilled champagne, a shattered engagement, 300 witnesses to a humiliation that had somehow cracked open the greatest secret of his life. I need that test, he said again, quieter now, gentler. Not because I don't believe every word you've said. Because I want to walk into a courtroom, a hospital, anywhere in this world, and say with complete certainty, this is my mother. I want proof so that no one ever can make either of us doubt this moment. Grace nodded, reaching out with trembling hands to hold his face the way she had once, decades ago, held the face of an 8-month-old baby for the very last time. Whatever the test says, she whispered, I already know the truth in my heart. I've known it since the moment I looked into your eyes tonight and saw my own mother's eyes looking back at me. Neither of them noticed the housekeeper standing frozen in the doorway. having witnessed the entire conversation, tears streaming silently down her own face. By morning, the story would begin to spread, not through gossip or tabloids, but through something far more powerful: the truth. The DNA results took 9 days to arrive. 9 days that changed everything about how Daniel Hayes moved through the world. He didn't go into the office once during that time. His executive assistant fielded calls, postponed board meetings, and told anyone who asked that Mr. Hayes was dealing with a private family matter. It wasn't a lie. Grace didn't return to her catering job either. Daniel had insisted, gently but firmly, that she stay at the estate while they waited. Not in the staff quarters, but in one of the guest suites overlooking the water, a room with a canopy bed and a view she had once cleaned but never been allowed to sleep in. At first, she'd resisted. "This isn't right," she told him on the first night. "I'm still just an employee to everyone else in this house." "You're my mother," Daniel said simply. "Nothing about that is just anything." Those 9 days became something neither of them had expected. Not tense, not awkward, but healing in a way that felt almost sacred. They spent hours in the estate's library, Grace telling him stories about his birth, about the 19-year-old girl she had been, terrified and alone and desperate to do right by a baby she loved more than her own survival. "I used to sing to you," she told him one evening, sitting by the fireplace. "Every night before I fell asleep, whether you were hungry or not, whether the heat in our apartment was working or not. I'd sing this old song my grandmother used to sing to me. You are my sunshine." It was the only lullaby I knew. Daniel felt something shift deep in his chest, an old buried memory surfacing like a stone rising through water. "My mother, Eleanor, the woman who raised me, she used to hum that same song when I couldn't sleep as a kid. I never understood why it felt so familiar. I thought maybe I'd heard it in a movie once." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "She must have gotten it from your file," she whispered. "The adoption caseworker asked me to write a letter for the adoptive parents. I wrote down the song. I wanted you to have something of mine, even something small, even if you never knew where it came from." Daniel had to leave the room for several minutes after that. When he came back, his eyes were red, and he sat down beside her without a word, letting the silence say what neither of them could. On the 10th day, the envelope arrived. Daniel's hands shook as he opened it in the estate study, Grace sitting across from him. Her own hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. He read the report twice before he could speak. "Grace Miller," he said finally, his voice thick, "is the biological mother of Daniel Hayes, with a probability of 99.998%. Grace made a sound Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. A sob of relief so deep it seemed to come from somewhere beyond her body, from 26 years of buried grief finally allowed to surface and breathe. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since he was 8 months old, mother and son held each other, no longer strangers separated by circumstance and silence, but exactly what they had always secretly been. "I'm so sorry," Grace wept into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry I couldn't keep you. I think about it every single day. Every birthday. Every March 14th, I wonder what you looked like, what you were doing, whether you were happy." "I was happy," Daniel said, his own tears falling freely now. "My parents loved me completely. I had every advantage a person could have. But there was always this quiet ache I could never name, like standing in a room and knowing a door was missing, even though the walls looked complete. You gave me a life of comfort. Do you understand what it means to know that the woman who gave me up did it out of the deepest love a person can offer? You didn't abandon me. You saved me. Twice. Once when you let me go, and once tonight when you let me find you again." They stayed like that for a long time, the fire crackling low in the hearth, 26 years of separation finally, impossibly, closing. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because 3 days later, Victoria Lang, humiliated, furious, and desperate to salvage her reputation after the video of her striking a maid had gone viral across every major news outlet in the country, decided she wasn't finished either. The video had 11 million views by the time Victoria's lawyers called. Someone at the party, no one ever confirmed who, had captured the entire ballroom scene on their phone, Victoria's cruel words, the crop striking Grace's shoulder, Daniel kneeling on the marble floor to tend to a stranger's wound with his bare hands. The clip had spread across every platform within hours. Headlines calling it, "The Billionaire Who Knelt for His Maid," and "The Engagement That Ended in Front of 300 Witnesses." What nobody outside the estate knew yet was the deeper truth beneath the headline, that the maid Victoria had humiliated was Daniel Hayes's biological mother. Victoria, unaware of this second revelation, saw an opportunity to control the narrative before it controlled her. She called a press conference of her own, standing outside her family's Manhattan penthouse in a tailored cream suit, tears carefully applied with waterproof mascara. "I made a mistake," she told the cameras, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. "I was under enormous stress planning our wedding, and I reacted poorly in a moment of panic. I've already reached out to the woman personally to apologize, and I hope Daniel and I can move past this and focus on our future together." The problem was, she hadn't reached out to Grace at all. Not a call, not a text, not a single word of apology. And when a journalist from a local paper tracked down Grace Miller for comment, Grace, still adjusting to her new world, still overwhelmed by everything happening around her, declined to speak publicly, wanting to protect the fragile new relationship she and Daniel were building. Her silence, however, didn't stop Victoria from trying to use her. 3 days after the DNA results confirmed the truth, Victoria showed up unannounced at the Hayes estate, demanding to see Daniel. The security guard at the gate called up to the main house, and Daniel, against his better judgment, agreed to let her in. One final conversation to close a chapter that needed closing properly. She found him in the study, Grace seated beside him on the couch, the two of them reviewing paperwork for a foundation Daniel had decided to start. One that would provide financial support to young single mothers considering adoption, ensuring no woman would ever again feel forced to give up a child purely out of poverty. "Can we talk privately?" Victoria asked, her eyes flicking toward Grace with poorly disguised contempt. "Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of my mother," Daniel replied evenly. Victoria froze. "You're what?" "My mother," Daniel repeated. "Grace Miller. My biological mother. Confirmed by DNA test 9 days ago. So whatever you came here to say, Victoria, I'd choose your words very carefully." Victoria's face went through several emotions in rapid succession. Shock, disbelief, and finally, a flicker of something that looked almost like fear, as she realized the magnitude of what she had done. She hadn't just struck an employee in front of 300 witnesses. She had struck the mother of the man she was supposed to marry. A woman who had once sacrificed everything for the very person Victoria had hoped to spend her life with. "I didn't know," Victoria said weakly. "Daniel, I swear if I had known. Would it have mattered?" Grace asked quietly, speaking for the first time. Her voice wasn't angry. It was calm, almost gentle. The voice of a woman who had survived far worse than a single cruel night. "Would you have treated me any differently if you'd known who I was to him? Or is the problem that you believe some people simply deserve less kindness than others?" Victoria had no answer. "I think you should leave," Daniel said. "The engagement is over. I signed the paperwork to formally end it 2 days ago. My lawyer will be in touch about the return of the ring and any related matters." "Daniel, please," Victoria said, her composure finally cracking. Real tears now instead of practiced ones. "I've known you for 2 years. Doesn't that mean anything?" "It meant everything to me," Daniel said, and for a moment, something like sadness crossed his face. Grief for the relationship he had believed was real. "But you showed me who you are underneath all of it, Victoria. Not the woman I built up in my head. The woman who thinks a person's worth is measured by their bank account or their uniform. I can't build a life with someone who sees the world that way." Victoria left without another word, her heels echoing sharply against the marble floor of the foyer. The very floor where, less than 2 weeks earlier, she had struck a woman she believed powerless, never imagining that woman would turn out to hold the truth of Daniel Hayes's entire identity in her hands. After the door closed behind her, Daniel exhaled slowly, and Grace reached over to squeeze his hand. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I will be," Daniel said. "For the first time in a long time, I actually believe that. But the story of Grace and Daniel Hayes was still only beginning to reach the public, and soon it would touch far more lives than either of them expected. 2 weeks after the video went viral, a woman named Carla Jennings reached out to the Hayes Global Investments media office, requesting to speak directly with Daniel. She wasn't a journalist. She wasn't an investor. She was a stranger with a story that would connect to Grace's in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Daniel agreed to meet her, mostly out of curiosity, in a small coffee shop near the estate rather than his office. He had grown wary of anything that felt too formal since the engagement's collapse. Carla was in her late 50s, soft-spoken, with kind eyes that carried the particular weight of someone who had spent decades doing quiet, difficult work. "I was the caseworker on your adoption," she told Daniel, sliding a worn manila folder across the table. 26 years ago. "I've thought about your case more than almost any other in my career." Daniel's hands stilled around his coffee cup. "You knew my mother, Grace." "I knew her well," Carla said, her voice heavy with emotion. "She was one of the most selfless young women I ever worked with. Most girls in her situation came to us desperate, scared, sometimes resentful of the process. Grace was different. She asked question after question about the adoptive family. Were they kind? Were they patient? Would they read to you at night? Would they hold you when you cried? She wanted to know everything because she couldn't be there to do those things herself, and she needed to know someone else would." Tears gathered in Daniel's eyes as Carla continued. "There's something else," Carla said carefully. "Something I probably should have told you both a long time ago, but the laws around sealed adoptions made it difficult. Grace didn't just give you up, Daniel. She fought for you first." "What do you mean?" Carla opened the folder and slid a document toward him. A handwritten letter, decades old, the ink faded but still legible. "6 months after you were born, Grace came back to the agency," Carla said. "She had gotten a stable job by then. A real one with benefits. She wanted you back. She'd saved every penny for 2 months, found a small apartment, done everything right. She came to fight for custody." Daniel stared at the letter, his heart pounding. What happened? The adoptive family had already begun the legal process to finalize everything, Carla said gently. Grace's request came in during the transition period, and the courts, back then, the laws favored finalized placements almost automatically once a certain timeline passed. Her lawyer told her that fighting it could take years, that she might lose regardless, that dragging you through a custody battle as an infant could be more traumatic than letting the adoption proceed as planned. She made the hardest decision of her life a second time. She let you go, believing it was better for you, even though it broke her completely. Daniel read the letter in Grace's careful youthful handwriting, dated 8 months after his birth. "I know I have no right to ask this, but please, if there's any way, I want my son back. I made a mistake letting him go too soon. I can care for him now. I love him more than anything in this world." He had to set the letter down, unable to keep reading through the blur of tears. "She never told me this," he whispered. "She probably never planned to," Carla said. "I think she carried the guilt of that failed attempt for the rest of her life, believing she'd tried and failed you twice instead of understanding that trying at all was its own kind of love." Daniel drove home that evening with a letter in his jacket pocket, his mind consumed with a single burning question. Why had his mother never told him this part of the story? He found Grace in the kitchen, preparing dinner the way she still insisted on doing most nights, despite Daniel's staff offering repeatedly to take over the task. "I met someone today," he said quietly, setting the folder on the counter. "Carla Jennings. Your old caseworker." Grace's face went pale. She set down the knife in her hand. "She told me you tried to get me back," Daniel said. 8 months after the adoption. "You fought for me, and you never told me." Grace's eyes filled instantly. "I didn't want you to know," she admitted. "I was ashamed. Ashamed that I gave you up in the first place, and then ashamed that I tried to take it back and failed at that too. I thought, what kind of mother does that to a child? Gives him away, then changes her mind, then loses the fight anyway. I thought the story would only hurt you." Daniel crossed the kitchen and pulled her into his arms, the letter still folded in his jacket pocket, pressed between them like a bridge finally completing itself after 26 years. "It doesn't hurt me," he said, his voice breaking. "It's the opposite. Knowing you fought for me even when it cost you everything, even when you lost, that's not shame, Mom. That's the greatest love story of my entire life." It was the first time he had called her Mom out loud. Neither of them would ever forget it. Word of the letter reached the public within a month, though not because Daniel or Grace sought publicity. A journalist writing a follow-up piece on the original viral video had reached out to Carla Jennings independently, and Carla, now retired and no longer bound by strict confidentiality obligations regarding a case both parties had publicly acknowledged, agreed to a brief interview confirming the broader emotional truth of the reunion. The story exploded far beyond anything Daniel or Grace anticipated. News outlets across the country picked it up, not as a scandal this time, but as something rarer, a genuine, unscripted story of love, sacrifice, and reunion that seemed to cut through the cynicism most people carried about the wealthy and powerful. Morning shows requested interviews. Magazines wanted exclusive photo spreads. A publishing house offered Grace a book deal to tell her story in her own words. Grace turned down almost everything. "I don't want to be famous," she told Daniel one evening, sitting on the back porch overlooking the water, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "I spent so many years being invisible that I don't know what to do with people actually looking at me now." "You don't have to do any of it," Daniel said. "Not one interview, not one photo, unless you want to." But there was one request Grace couldn't refuse. A letter from a young woman named Talia, 19 years old, 6 months pregnant, writing to say that Grace's story had given her the courage to consider options she hadn't believed were possible. She had been planning to place her baby for adoption out of financial desperation, terrified and alone exactly as Grace had once been. And reading about Grace's journey had made her feel, for the first time, that her choice, whatever she decided, didn't have to be made in shame or silence. Grace read the letter 3 times before showing it to Daniel. "I want to help her," she said. "Not just her. Girls like her everywhere. Girls who feel like they have to choose between loving their child and being able to feed them." This was the moment the Hayes Miller Foundation was born, though neither of them called it that at first. It started as a single conversation on the porch, Daniel pulling out his laptop right there in the autumn air, drafting a mission statement while Grace spoke, her voice growing steadier and more certain with every word. "We provide housing assistance," Grace said, pacing now, energy building in her the way it hadn't in years. "Job training, childcare support, so no mother has to give up her child purely because of poverty, the way I almost had to. And for mothers who do choose adoption for whatever reason, we make sure it's an open, supported choice, not a desperate one made in a hospital room with no other options. And legal support," Daniel added, typing quickly. "So no mother who changes her mind like you did has to face a system stacked against her without help." Within 3 months, the foundation had raised over $40 million, some from Daniel's own fortune, but the majority from ordinary people across the country who had watched the viral video, followed the story, and felt something in their own hearts crack open the way Daniel's had that night in the ballroom. Talia became the foundation's first recipient of full support, housing, healthcare, career counseling, and ultimately made the choice to keep and raise her daughter, something she said she never would have believed possible without Grace's story reaching her at exactly the right moment. "You saved her the way you couldn't save yourself back then," Daniel told Grace after Talia's daughter was born, a healthy 7 pounds 4 ounces, named Grace in her honor. Grace wept for an hour after hearing that. But even amid all this healing, one thread remained unresolved. The daughter Grace had raised herself, the sister Daniel had never met. And soon that reunion would arrive too, carrying its own complicated weight. Her name was Maya, and she was 26 years old. Exactly the number of years that had passed since Grace gave up the baby who would become Daniel Hayes. Maya had grown up knowing about her older half-brother in only the vaguest terms. A nameless shape in her mother's past, a grief Grace rarely spoke of except in quiet, private moments Maya had learned young not to interrupt. She knew her mother had given up a son before she was born. She didn't know his name, his face, or that he had grown into one of the wealthiest men in the country, until she turned on the evening news one night and saw her mother's face on the screen, standing beside a man the anchor identified as billionaire CEO Daniel Hayes. Maya had called Grace in tears that same night, overwhelmed with questions 26 years in the making. Now, a month later, she stood nervously at the front door of the Hayes estate, her hands trembling around a small bouquet of flowers she'd bought at a gas station because she didn't know what else to bring to meet a brother she'd never known existed until weeks earlier. Daniel opened the door himself. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maya had their mother's eyes. The same warm brown, the same steady, searching quality Daniel had first noticed in Grace on the worst night of her professional life. "Hi," Maya said finally, her voice small. "I'm Maya," Daniel finished. "I know. Mom's told me everything about you." The word mom, spoken so easily now, still occasionally caught Daniel off guard, a small miracle he hadn't yet gotten used to. Maya's eyes filled with tears. "This is so strange," she admitted with a wet laugh. "I've spent my whole life as an only child, and now I have a brother who's worth more money than I can even comprehend." "For what it's worth," Daniel said, stepping aside to let her in, "the money's the least interesting thing about me. Ask Mom. She'll tell you I still don't know how to work the espresso machine in the kitchen." Maya laughed, a real laugh this time, some of the nervous tension breaking, and followed him inside. Grace was waiting in the living room, and when Maya saw her mother's face, both women broke into tears simultaneously, embracing tightly in a way that had nothing to do with billionaires or reunions or viral videos, and everything to do with a mother and daughter who had shared 26 years of an ordinary, complicated, loving life together, a life that had just expanded to include someone neither of them had ever expected to meet. Over dinner that night, Maya asked the question that had been building in her since she first saw the news broadcast. "Are you angry at her?" she asked Daniel quietly, while Grace was in the kitchen retrieving dessert. "For giving you up. I used to wonder about that growing up. Whether somewhere out there, my mom's first child hated her for it." Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "I was angry," he admitted. "For about 4 seconds the first night I learned the truth. Angry that I'd grown up without her. Angry at a version of events I didn't even understand yet. But then she told me why. She told me what it cost her to make that choice. And I realized, anger isn't the right response to someone who loved you enough to give up everything for your sake. Anger is what you feel toward someone who takes, not someone who sacrifices." Maya wiped her eyes. "She used to cry on my birthday sometimes," she confessed. "I never understood why until now. I always thought it was strange. Most moms cry from joy on their kid's birthday, not from something sadder underneath it. Now I know she wasn't just celebrating me. She was also thinking of you. Every single year." Grace returned with dessert to find both her children crying at the table, and though she didn't know exactly what had been said, she understood immediately, setting down the tray and pulling them both into an embrace that held 26 years of longing, grief, guilt, and finally, impossibly, joy. "I used to pray," Grace admitted through her own tears, "that somehow someday you two would know each other. I never believed it would actually happen. I never let myself believe it, because believing and losing that belief would have broken me." "Well," Maya said, laughing through her tears, "get ready, Mom. Because I fully intend to make up for 26 years of missed birthdays. Starting with mine, which is in 3 weeks, and yes, Daniel, I already know you're rich, so the gift bar has been set extremely high." The room filled with laughter, real, unguarded, healing laughter, the sound of a family finally whole, sitting around a table that had once been set for wealth and status, now set instead for something far more valuable. But their story, remarkable as it already was about to reach one final chapter, one that would bring the entire journey full circle in a way none of them could have predicted. 1 year after the night Victoria Lang struck Grace Miller with a riding crop in front of 300 witnesses, the Hayes Miller Foundation held its first annual gala. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The event was held in the very same ballroom where it had all begun, the same chandeliers, the same marble floors, Except this time, the room was filled not with the city's wealthiest elite competing for social status, but with hundreds of young mothers the foundation had supported over the past year, alongside their children, their families, and the volunteers and donors who had made their new beginnings possible. Grace stood at the podium that evening, wearing not a maroon uniform but a deep blue gown Maya had helped her choose. Her hands steady on the microphone in a way that would have seemed impossible to her a year earlier. A year ago, I stood in this exact room in a uniform, and a woman struck me with a whip because I spilled champagne on her dress, Grace told the crowd, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. I want to thank her, actually. I never thought I'd say those words. But if that night hadn't happened exactly the way it did, I never would have found my son again. I never would have started this foundation. I never would have met the 412 mothers and children in this room tonight who now have homes, jobs, healthcare, and futures they didn't believe were possible a year ago. Applause thundered through the ballroom. People look at wealth and think it measures worth, Grace continued. I spent 11 years cleaning up after people who believed that. I spent 26 years believing, somewhere quietly inside myself, that giving up my son meant I had failed as a mother. I want every young woman in this room to hear me say clearly, love is not measured by what you can afford to give. It's measured by what you're willing to sacrifice. And sometimes, if you're lucky, if the universe finds a way to circle back, that sacrifice comes home to you in ways you never imagined. She looked out into the crowd, finding Daniel's face immediately, his eyes glistening with pride and love. 26 years ago, I let my son go because I believed it was the only way to save him, she said, her voice breaking slightly. A year ago in this room, he knelt down and saved me right back. That's the story I want every person here to carry home tonight. Not the story of what was taken from us, but the story of what love finds a way to return. Daniel stood, applauding with the rest of the room, tears streaming freely down his face, unashamed. Beside him, Maya cried into a napkin, and further back near the entrance stood Talia, holding her 1-year-old daughter Grace against her chest, both of them living proof of exactly what Grace's sacrifice, decades later, had made possible for someone else entirely. After the speeches ended and the gala shifted into a quieter celebration, Daniel found a moment alone with his mother near the same spot on the marble floor where he had knelt beside her a year earlier. I have something for you, he said, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Grace's eyes widened. Daniel, you don't need to. It's not what you think, he said, smiling as he opened it. Inside wasn't jewelry, but a small, weathered object, a tiny knitted baby blanket, yellowed slightly with age. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Where did you? My parents kept it, Daniel said. Eleanor told me years ago that it was the only thing that came with me from the adoption agency. A blanket and a small note pinned to it that just said, "Please keep him warm. All my love, always." I never understood who wrote it until this year. I asked her to give it to me last month. I wanted you to have it back. Grace held the tiny blanket against her chest, sobbing openly now. The same blanket she had wrapped around her 8-month-old son the last time she held him, 26 years and one impossible reunion ago. I never stopped loving you, she whispered. Not for a single day. I know, Daniel said, wrapping his arms around her. I know, Mom. And now I never have to wonder again. 3 years have passed since that night in the ballroom. The Hayes Miller Foundation now operates in 14 states, having helped over 6,000 mothers and children build stable, independent lives. Grace serves as the foundation's president, a role she never imagined for herself, though those who know her say she was built for exactly this kind of quiet, determined leadership all along. Daniel remarried 2 years ago. Not Victoria, but a pediatric nurse named Sarah he met while touring one of the foundation's partner hospitals. Their wedding, held at the same estate, was small and intimate, nothing like the extravagant party planned with Victoria years before. Grace walked him down the aisle, a mother finally present for a milestone she once believed she'd never witness. Maya works as the foundation's director of family services, And she and Daniel talk almost every day now. The 26 years of separation replaced by something closer to lifelong closeness, the kind of sibling bond most people take decades to build, compressed instead into 3 years of determined, joyful effort to make up for lost time. And Talia, the young mother whose letter first inspired the Foundation's mission, now works alongside Grace as a peer counselor, helping other frightened, pregnant young women see a path forward that doesn't require choosing between love and survival. Every March 14th, the entire family gathers at the estate to celebrate 2 things at once: Daniel's birthday and what they now call Reunion Day, the anniversary of the night everything changed. Grace always sings "You Are My Sunshine," just as she did the very first year, her voice a little stronger each time, the song no longer a symbol of loss, but of everything finally fully found. If there's one lesson this story leaves behind, it's this: the people we overlook, the ones we dismiss as invisible, as beneath our attention, as simply the help, they carry entire lives, entire histories, entire oceans of love and sacrifice we know nothing about. Grace Miller spent 11 years disappearing into the wallpaper of other people's celebrations, quietly carrying a grief no one around her ever noticed. And it took one act of cruelty, witnessed by the right person at exactly the right moment, to bring that hidden love back into the light. Kindness costs nothing. Cruelty, as Victoria Lang learned, can cost everything. And sometimes, the person you look past without a second glance is carrying the very love that once saved your life, patiently waiting for the moment you finally see them. If this story moved you tonight, if it made you think differently about the people you pass by every single day, the tired mother, the quiet coworker, the stranger doing their best, please take a moment to like this video. It helps this story and stories like it reach more people who need to hear them. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this one. Real, raw, human stories about love, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways life brings us back to who we're meant to find. And if you know someone who needs a reminder tonight that love finds its way home, no matter how many years pass, share this story with them. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.